This week class we're looking at Foreign Affairs, Trouble of the Nation. We're also looking at chapter 6.2 when Jefferson actually becomes the third president of the United States. Looking at our objectives, we're looking at foreign policy. We're also looking at how the U.S. dealt with natives at this time. And we're also looking more at Republicans versus the Federalists, which we looked a little bit at about a week and a half ago. So this is how the U.S. responds to different events in Europe. Now the major event that they start responding to is the French Revolution. Many Americans agree with the French Revolution. The French were trying to do exactly what the Americans were doing with the British. They wanted to declare a democracy. I spelled democracy wrong, please forgive that. But what Americans didn't want to necessarily do is join France in their fight. So in the Treaty of 1778, if you remember, the French helped Americans during the American Revolutionary War. Well, now what the French wanted to do was call in the favor. They wanted the U.S. to join France during their revolution. Americans end up becoming divided about this. What ends up happening is we have the Democratic Republicans, which is Jefferson and Madison. They want to go to war. They want to help support the French. Whereas we have the Federalists, that's Hamilton's side. He wants to stay neutral. While Hamilton agrees that France should go and have a revolution, he doesn't necessarily want to join them. So eventually, Jefferson and Hamilton decide that America should not go to war, and they are not honoring the Treaty of 1778. But what ends up happening is we have a Frenchman comes to try and convince Americans to join. His name is Edmund Gent. What ends up happening is Jefferson actually ends up protecting him, which dishonors his neutrality. So Edmund ends up becoming an American citizen, which means that it's going against the U.S. being neutral in the French Revolution. This results in Jefferson getting a little upset and deciding he has had enough. So Jefferson quits Washington's cabinet. He basically, because Jefferson and Hamilton fight so often, he decided that he was just not going to fight with him anymore. Another thing that ends up happening is we have a treaty with Spain. With Spain, if you remember, Spain has a lot of the Western lands, and the U.S. wants to spread and colonize more of these Western lands. Now, up until this point, Spain had signed a treaty with France, but Spain viewed America and Britain as more of a threat to Spain than France. So what ends up happening is we actually have Spain agrees to sign another treaty with Americans, giving them the right to colonize and move to these Western lands. So areas that used to be Spanish have now fallen into more, are now allowing Americans to move there. Then we have Native Americans resist white settlers. So it starts here. As you can see, now we have Americans starting to move more and more west. It starts with Great Britain. They actually still have some forts in the west of the Appalachians. And these forts that have British troops, that is in violation of the treaty with the Americas during the Revolutionary War. But up until this point, Americans were not moving there, so they decided that it wasn't a big deal that there were British troops. But now, since Americans were expanding, they wanted that land and they wanted the British out. Now, if we remember, the natives, they were not included in the treaty at the end of the Revolutionary War. So while there are British troops in the West, there are also many native tribes. And they are not really considered as people, and Americans don't really even try to speak with them about a compromise. Well, of course, what ends up happening is we have these natives are going to start resisting the American settlers who are starting to come. And the British troops at these British forts, they're also encouraging natives to do this. They want them to fight with Americans. So we have the Miami Confederacy. Now if you remember, Confederacy is an alliance of different people groups. So in this case, it's talking about many different native tribes are coming together to try and resist these white settlers. The person who leads the Miami Confederacy, his name is Little Turtle, and they are going to fight Americans. Miami, they actually win 2 battles against Americans. If you can picture, in the West, Americans are not as equipped or as well armed as you would see in the East. So what ends up happening is we have Washington appoints a general whose name is General Anthony, or Mad Anthony. And Mad Anthony, he's getting an army ready to fight these natives. Little Turtle, remember Little Turtle is the leader of the Miami Confederacy, he ends up wanting peace. He sees that General Anthony is very good at training an army, and they don't actually think that the Miami Confederacy can win. But many of the other chiefs didn't. So the other chiefs wanted to fight. But General Anthony and his army were too strong, and they defeated these other chiefs. It ends with Miami Confederacy giving up or signing a treaty that gives much of the western lands to Americans. So now settlers are sort of free to settle there. They also, these settlers end up paying less for the lands than that they're actually worth. So many of these Native American groups, they're not being paid properly for the land. The last thing we have one more treaty by John Jay. So John Jay, he's a Supreme Court judge, and he is also creating a treaty between America and Britain. So when he hears that the battle at Timbers ends, John Jay has a treaty ready for America and Britain. And what this states is that all British troops must leave Western lands. Britain does end up signing this. They don't necessarily want to sign this, but at this point they are forced to. George Washington doesn't end up staying president. He retires after his first term. So what we end up having is we have our second person coming into office, which is John Adams. That was the vice president of Washington. So we have John Adams and Thomas Jefferson. They are competing against each other for the presidency. But it was a pretty clear thing that John Adams was going to win. What ends up happening, though, is this leads to sectionalism. What sectionalism is that both John Adams and Thomas Jefferson put their own agenda and own personal region ahead of the national government. This, again, provides disunity between the nations. So Adam wins, but in the Constitution, it states that the runner-up is going to be the vice president. So now, what promotes this idea of sectionalism is we have Adams being the president, and Jefferson, who has very different opinions, is his vice president. So basically, this means that nothing can really get done because these two main guys in the executive branch don't get along. Adams, one of the first things that he encounters being president is the fact that now he has France is upset at the States. Because if you remember, the States did not join the French Revolution. This leads to sort of this ridiculous thing called the XYZ affair. What happens is the French officials, they send people to America and they demand for these ridiculous numbers for breaking the treaty that Americans and French had. What ends up happening is many Americans then start hating French. They end up starting to seize a lot of the French ships. The last thing is that even though this is not an official war, because Americans have start to hate the French, and the French, of course, are starting to hate Americans, we have is an unofficial war where they're both attacking each other's trade ships. The last thing I want to sort of look at very quickly is Alien and Sedition Acts. So another thing that John Adams does during his presidency is that they start to put more limits on immigrants. And the limits they put is that you have to wait 14 years if you immigrate to the U.S. until you become an official American. This is a huge jump from 5 years of what it was. And the reason is because John Adams was realizing that many new immigrants sided on Jefferson's side, on the Democratic Republic side, not the Federalist side. This was trying to limit people who would normally be a Democrat Republic. They are then not really allowed to vote. Jefferson and Madison, they believed that these acts was in opposition to the Constitution. They said it was an unconstitutional thing and it should not be really considered or be able to go through.